Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church presents Union Gospel Presses Sunday School Lesson number 7, Sunday, July 14, 2019. The lesson is entitled The Son of Promise. Lesson text comes from Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 through 10. Related scriptures are Hebrews 11 through 12, Luke 1:13, 18 through 25 and 36, John 16:21 through 22, Galatians 4:21 through 31. The place is Canaan. The time is 2065 BC. There is nothing like seeing a promise fulfilled. Many promises are made, but not all of them are kept. People make promises for all kinds of reasons, but often without any intention of doing what they vowed to do. Thankfully, God is not like that. God always keeps his promises, even if it is not when or how we want him to. Waiting on God requires faith, which requires that we resist taking matters into our own hands when we think he needs our help. This week's lesson shows that God's ways are greater than any wildest dreams, and a wise person will always wait on him. Today's aim, facts. To realize that God always fulfills his word. Principle. To become convinced that faithfulness to the Lord will always result in blessing from the Lord. Application. To share what God has done for you in the past with someone who is struggling with faith. Illustrating the lesson. It is difficult to wait on the Lord, especially when the waiting seems to take so long. However, there is joy and blessing for those who persevere in faith. Practical points. 1. Expect God to reward your patience and faith. Genesis 21, 1 through 2. 2. Believers experience God's power as we trust his promises. Verses 3 through 4. 3. God never runs out of time. Verse 5. 4. In difficult life situations, look to God in faith, trusting him to restore your joy. Verse 6. 5. Things that seem impossible pose no difficulty for God. Verse 7. 6. To keep your eyes on God's promises, celebrate God's goodness. Verse 8. 7. People cannot do anything to thwart God's promise or his plan. Verses 9 through 10. Golden text. Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. Genesis 21, 2. Today we have two lesson outlines. The first is birth of the promised son, Genesis 21, 1 through 7. The second is conflict over the two sons, Genesis 21, 8 through 10. Introduction. Few things are more exciting in a family than the birth of a baby. Most of us have seen or heard of some of the various ways people break the news to other family members. Sometimes it is the wife telling her husband, sometimes it is parents telling their parents, and sometimes it is parents breaking the news to the other children. Reactions are varied, and not all of them are positive. One memorable report showed the wife asking her husband to look in the oven to see if she had accidentally left something in there instead of putting it in the cupboard with the pots and pans. When he looked, he found, to his utter confusion, a single biscuit sitting on a rack. She repeatedly asked him what he found there and received a variety of not too brilliant responses. After several minutes, he realized there was a bun in the oven. Abraham and Sarah had waited for decades for the son God promised. They saw a baby born through Hagar. God promised that Sarah herself would give birth to that chosen one. Birth of the promised son. Genesis 21, 1. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. Verse 2. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. Verse 3. And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bare to him, Isaac. Verse 4. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Verse 5. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born unto him. Verse 6. And Sarah said, God have made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. Verse 7. And she said, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age. God's faithfulness. Genesis 21:1. Abraham's faith was finally rewarded. He had been in the land of Canaan for 25 years and had received the specific promise of a son, 15:1-6. He had believed God's promise, and God had counted his faith to him as righteousness. Based on this experience, the New Testament sets forth Abraham as the prototype of those justified by faith. Romans 4:1-12, 16:19-25, Galatians 3:5-9, Hebrews 11:8-12. Only faith is needed for salvation, not works. Isaac's birth took place according to God's promise and direct involvement, Genesis 21:1. The beginning of the record of this incident points clearly to the faithfulness of God to his promises. At the time he had designated, the Lord visited Sarah. The word visited does not describe a brief stop to chat with someone. It indicates action on God's part. Scripture repeatedly uses the word to describe the Lord's coming to do something with special for his people. When Joseph was dying, he assured his brothers that God would visit them and return them to their homeland. Genesis 50:24-25. In Exodus 4:31, the people rejoiced when they heard God had visited them and was going to deliver them. Naomi decided to return home upon hearing that God had visited Judah, bringing an end to the famine there. Ruth 1:6. Hannah gave birth to several children after God had visited her. 1 Samuel 2:21. God promised through Jeremiah that after 75 years of captivity, he would visit his people and allow them to return to their homeland. Jeremiah 29:10. Sarah had borne the burden of childlessness for many years, a heavy burden indeed in that culture and at that time. People must have smiled when they heard that her husband's name was Abraham, father of a multitude. He was the father of one son, Ishmael, but that was far from a multitude, and Sarah had never given birth. But now all of her reproach was ended, and they were rejoicing in the arrival of their son, Isaac's birth. Genesis 21:2-3. Once again, the faithfulness of God to his promises is emphasized. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. God had previously given Abraham a specific timetable. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year. 17:21. Not only can God be trusted for the fulfillment of his promises, but his timing is always perfect as well, even when we have doubts about it. Here is a good example of the fact that all life comes directly from God. He was clearly involved directly in this baby's conception and birth. Psalms 127 reminds us, lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is the man that have his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate. Verses 3 through 5. Children are a special blessing from God. It should be obvious that if all life comes from God, it is only God who can legitimately take life. In the Ten Commandments, murder heads the list of the second table prohibitions. Exodus 20:13. Apart from the specific instructions concerning the death penalty for those who commit murder or other heinous crimes, no man or woman is ever to take the life of another human being. It is only in the context of human government and those in authority that allowance is made for the taking of life. Genesis 9:6, Exodus 21:12 through 14. Abraham named his son Isaac in obedience to the Lord's command. Genesis 17:19. As insignificant as this might seem to be, even this naming was an act of faith since it was done in the response to a command of God. Isaac's name means he laughs, and we noted in last week's lesson that God chose it after Abraham laughed in response to his promise of a son through Sarah. Isaac would be a source of joy to his parents, making his name a fitting one. Isaac was conceived through the supernatural work of God and named prior to conception. The same was true of the Lord Jesus. Isaac was the initial fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. Jesus was the ultimate fulfillment. Isaac would continue the line that would extend all the way to the one through whom blessing would come upon the world. Isaac's circumcision, Genesis 21:4 through 5. Abraham's next act of obedience was to have Isaac circumcised. Circumcision had been established as the sign of the Abrahamic covenant and was required on the 8th day after birth, 17:10-13. God had said this was a token of the covenant betwixt me and you, verse 11. And it was so important that he decreed, and the uncircumcised man-child, whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He have broken my covenant, verse 14. Circumcision, cutting away the male foreskin, was not entirely new in this period of history, but the special religious and theocratic significance then applied to it was entirely new, thus identifying the circumcised as belonging to the physical and ethical lineage of Abraham. Acts 7:8, Romans 4:11. Without divine revelation, the rite would not have had this distinctive significance. Thus, it reminded a theocratic distinctive of Israel. Abraham's age at the time of Isaac's birth was 100 years. There was more than one miracle involved here. Sarah was barren and past the age of having children now that she was 90 years old. The author of Hebrews writes, Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age 11. We assume this indicates that her reproductive system was no longer active. For her to give birth, therefore, required divine enablement. Hebrews describes Abraham with the phrase as good as dead, verse 12. This refers to his elderly status as opposed to the cessation of his reproductive ability. The fact is that after Isaac's birth, he fathered 6 more children in his second marriage, Genesis 25:1 through 2. The importance of Isaac's birth is emphasized in Hebrews 11 in the statement that from this one son there were descended so many as the stars of the sky in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore innumerable. Verse 12. Sarah's joy, Genesis 21:6 through 7. Sarah's laughter this time was not of doubt, 18:12 through 15, but rather of overflowing joy. In fact, her joy was so great, she was convinced that all who knew her were going to be joining her in amazement and rejoicing. All that here will laugh with me, 21:6, she said. Everybody was going to be amazed that she had given birth in her old age, and she assumed everyone would be happy for her. It was going to be a time of thanksgiving with no envy or jealousy associated with it. Sarah then expressed the same amazement with regard to Abraham. She imagined that no one would have ever thought Abraham would have a son with his elderly wife, who in turn would be able to suckle a child. Who could believe that Abraham would have a son at 100 years of age and live to raise him to adulthood? But doing the impossible is everyday business with God. Our big problems won't seem so impossible if we let God handle them. Do you suppose there has ever been a child born who was more loved than Isaac? No doubt there have been many as loved, but it is certain that this couple immensely loved this promised son. It is also certain that he was taught in the ways of righteousness. When God appeared to Abraham prior to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 18, he decided to let Abraham know his intentions. This decision was based on his servant's character. The Lord said of Abraham, "For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, that they shall keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him." Verse 19. God knew all along that Isaac would be given spiritual training, and we see the evidence of it in his life. Conflict over the two sons. Verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. Verse 9. And Sarah saw that the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Verse 10. Wherefore she said unto Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. The problem, Genesis 21, 8 through 9. The excitement over Isaac's birth eventually changed, and a day intended for celebration became a day of family tension. It was the day for Isaac to be weaned, when he transitioned from infancy to childhood. In that culture, it is probable that he was at least 2 or 3 years old at the time, and the event was celebrated with a huge feast. It was meant to be a day of happiness and more laughter. The change of mood involved the older son, Ishmael, who was now 16 or 17 years old, 16. Until the birth of Isaac, he had been viewed as the designated heir of Abraham. So it might be that all the attention being given to Isaac caused him to become jealous, perhaps even to the point of real resentment. Sarah saw him mocking Isaac, 21:9. The Hebrew word means to laugh at or to make sport of. We would say he was making fun of Isaac, taunting or ridiculing him in some way. It is significant that Ishmael is referred to as the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, without using his name. Ishmael was clearly not in the secondary position of the line of Abraham, and the text indicates that he was unwilling to acknowledge it. Sarah must have become alarmed at what she saw, thinking this could be the beginning of many future problems. Much later, Paul wrote, He that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the spirit. Galatians 4:29. Paul was writing about the difference between being under the law and being under grace, and he used the two sons of Abraham to illustrate the contrast. He introduced this by stating, It is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid and the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise. Verses 22 to 23. He used the two in a symbolic way to refer to the law given at Mount Sinai and the grace now available through Jesus. Paul made it clear that the existence of Ishmael and Isaac had far-reaching meaning and that the conflict between them still has a lesson for us. We have the option of living after the flesh or living under the leading of God's Spirit. The demand, Genesis 21:10. The word that Paul used in Galatians translated persecuted means to pursue. Pursuit normally indicates following someone with the intention of overtaking or capturing them. This would indicate that Ishmael was quite aggressive in his mocking and apparently was bullying Isaac. It is not surprising then that Sarah demanded that both Hagar and Ishmael be cast out of the household. Perhaps this even suggests that Hagar was encouraging Ishmael in his actions. Sarah made it clear that she was not going to tolerate competition to her son's inheritance. So, in her mind, the only solution was for Ishmael and his mother to be sent away permanently. She did not even refer to them by name, but simply as the bondwoman and her son. Paul quoted Sarah's words with only slight variation. Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman, Galatians 4:30. He then made the comparison that we are children of freedom and not slaves to the legalism of the law. Paul compared Christians to Isaac, who was born through God's promise. Ishmael, however, had been born by human design. Paul explained that Isaac suffered persecution just as the Galatian believers were suffering at the hands of those still bound by the law, who were insisting that Gentile Christians also follow the Old Testament law. Sarah's demand was extremely painful for Abraham, Genesis 21:11. But God reassured him that his covenant promises were going to be fulfilled through Isaac, verse 12. Here is another reminder that if we are going to experience God's fullest blessings, we must be obedient to his ways instead of our own. Questions. 1. How did Abraham become a prototype of those justified by faith? 2. What statements remind us that this event was the result of God's faithfulness? 3. Why did Abraham name his son Isaac, and what does it mean? 4. What was Abraham's next act of obedience, and why was this so important to him? 5. How old was Abraham at the time of Isaac's birth? 6. What was the meaning of Sarah's laughter this time? 7. What special occasion turned into a time of tension? 8. What specifically caused the rejoicing to turn to bitterness? 9. What did Sarah demand from Abraham as a result? 10. How did Paul apply this incident to spiritual realities faced by Christians? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, July 14, 2019. Thank you for listening. God bless.